You never go into an abandoned building, no matter what, and when I was 14, I learned that the hard way. I lived in a simple neighborhood that wasn't too big. It was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone and everywhere, and as kids, we were told to stay away from an apartment complex that sat close to the outskirts of town. There had been rumors of a mass murder that had once taken place in the building. Being young, we often dared ourselves to ride past the building, and it was a pretty easy dare that left shivers down your spine. You come face to face with the tall old gray building, staring at the paint peeling off the walls, and in some places, the floors were exposed to the evening sky. It was enough to get your pants wet, but no one had ever dared to ride through the bent gates of the apartment to explore. Some kids claimed they hadn't thought of it, but I knew the reason was fear. On a Friday night, I rode past the building with two of my friends. We call them Gail and Francis. We took the trip out of boredom, desperately needing to pass time before we'd head home for the weekend. We'd parked our bikes across the building, staring hard at it while discussing amongst ourselves. Francis turned to us, and his eyes grew wide like he had seen something. "Guys, there's a light coming from in there." I looked at him in disbelief, knowing that the place hadn't been used in a long time. There was no way someone could have been in that building, but to my surprise, I looked in the direction of the building and I saw it. A light seemed to flicker from one of the rooms on the top floor. "Let's go explore it," Francis said. "No one has ever done it before. Imagine the bragging rights we'd get. We'd be so cool." It wasn't out of character for Francis to request this sort of thing. He'd been known to be bold, and even in a setting like this, he wanted to go find out what was what. Gail and I obviously refused, but he persisted, and I began to grow curious about the flickering light on the last floor. We gave in, and he led the way, maneuvering through the bent gates into the small parking area. The apartment was eerie, and if I hadn't thought it was, I was more than sure of it now. We made our way through a big open hole by the side of the ground floor and immediately took in the ruined state of this place. It was worse than I imagined, but you could tell it used to be a place that everyone wanted to get into. There were old carpets and light fixtures of all fancy shapes and sizes. I imagined were impressive for its time. We pulled out of phones and used them as flashlights to navigate the area. We were looking for a flight of stairs. We couldn't take the elevator as it was out of service. We found the stairway easily. Some steps were missing, but it was definitely still usable. It was only 4 floors up, and we thought it wouldn't hurt to take the steps. Francis led the way. Gail followed, but I lingered behind, an awful feeling beginning to creep up on me. I pointed my phone in the direction we had come in, and I saw something flash around the entrance. It was so brief that I blinked, and I stared back at the open space, seeing nothing. I must have hallucinated it. After all, I was feeling a lot of fear. We made our way carefully up the steps, listening to our breathing and steps echo through the building. I wanted this adventure to come to an end, and I almost let out a sigh of relief when we got to the last floor. I expected to peer into the room, see nothing, and then we'd go downstairs, but my thoughts were cut short when Francis froze at the top of the stairs. "Do you hear that?" He whispered, and we listened to the sounds of heavy footsteps, but we couldn't tell where they were coming from. This should have been our sign to turn around and leave, but we stood in silence for what was the longest 3 minutes of our lives, and then we heard something else. Heavy breathing and footsteps heading in our direction. One of the rooms creaked open, and that was our cue. We bolted downstairs, taking the lead this time. My breathing was heavy as I could hear the sounds of our pursuer or pursuers coming from us. We ran without thinking, and we were finally on the ground floor when I fell. I was so caught up in the moment, I tripped over my feet and fell. Francis pushed past me, running as fast as he could. Gale stayed behind to try and help me up, but the fear was intense. He let go of my hand and made his way out of the building. The heavy footsteps grew to a crescendo just above me, and I was prepared for the worst. I closed my eyes and pointed my phone's flashlight in the direction of the stairs, bracing myself. There was nothing. The sounds of feet against the floor ceased, and I laid there for a minute confused. I didn't stay too long, however, because I was up on my feet and trailing my friends as fast as I could. I was out of the gate and on my bicycle. I found them panting next to theirs, waiting for me. We didn't say a word as I caught our breaths, staring at the room where the light had come from. We watched in horror as someone came close to the window and turned the light we had seen off. We scrambled on our bikes and rode away, swearing we would never speak of it to anyone. Some nights, I can't help but think of what would have become of us if we had found that room and if we had gone in. I took the night shift at the warehouse for the extra cash. It was supposed to be an easy gig, just a few hours of moving boxes, checking inventory, and then locking up. But that night still haunts me, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. It was a massive, cold building, the kind where the fluorescent lights flicker just enough to make you wonder if you're really alone. The place was dead silent after hours, except for the hum of the freezers in the back and the occasional creak of metal shelving. Mike, my usual partner for these shifts, had called in sick, leaving me alone in the vast, echoing space. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I figured I'd just get through it and be done. The first few hours were uneventful, just the usual monotony of unloading boxes and checking them off on the inventory list. Around midnight, I started hearing noises. At first, it was just faint, like a distant rustling, almost like someone was dragging something heavy across the concrete floor. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the old building settling. But the noises got louder, closer. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans of the place. It was deliberate, like someone, or something, was moving around, trying to stay out of sight. My heart started racing, but I tried to play it cool, telling myself it was just a rat or maybe a stray cat that had wandered in. Then I heard the sound of something being dragged. It was a low, grinding noise, like metal scraping against the floor. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I decided to investigate, if only to prove to myself that it was nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the back of the warehouse, where the noise seemed to be coming from. As I walked down the narrow aisles, the sound grew louder, more menacing. My flashlight flickered, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a mannequin, a figure standing perfectly still in the dim light. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a mannequin. It was a man, or at least it had been a man. His clothes were torn, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. He was standing there, his back to me, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His hands were twisted, claw-like, as if they'd been broken and never healed properly. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was like he was waiting for something. I slowly backed away, but as I did, the man's head jerked around to face me. His eyes, if you could even call them that, were sunken, hollow sockets that stared straight through me. His mouth hung open, revealing a row of broken, jagged teeth. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing off the walls as I sprinted back toward the front of the warehouse. But no matter how fast I ran, the noise of something being dragged followed me, like it was right on my heels. I could hear his raspy breath, the sound of bare feet slapping against the concrete. I reached the front, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto them. I finally got the door open and stumbled outside, slamming it shut behind me. I could still hear the dragging noise, now muffled by the heavy door. I didn't dare look back. I jumped into my car and sped off, my heart pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I quit the next day, refusing to go back there, even to collect my last paycheck. I told them I had a family emergency and couldn't work anymore. I never told anyone what really happened, not because they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want to remember. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound, the slow, relentless dragging of something heavy across the floor, and the memory of those hollow, empty eyes that still haunts me.